So my talk today will be to introduce Northwest BioTrust for those of you who may not be familiar with that term as yet, and give you a sense for what some of the challenges are, especially economic challenges associated with biobanking and how we are solving those problems. I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit between University of Washington and University of Minnesota because much of our business plan, if you will, is predicated on the successful model that we established in Minnesota. I have no disclosures. So Northwest BioTrust is a collaboration between the university, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and Seattle Children's Hospital and the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance to deliver appropriately consented and annotated biospecimens to the research community. This Northwest BioTrust is the business function, really, or the successor organization to grant-funded work under Peggy Porter, her LSDF Cancer Consortium Biospecimen Resource, and John Slattery's Washington Phenotype Biospecimen Resource. Those two LSDF-funded efforts were for cancer-related projects and non-cancer-related projects, respectively, and both of those types of projects are being driven now through Northwest BioTrust. In addition to me, others from my team were recruited from Minnesota as part of my coming out here. Sarah Bowl, who is our assistant director, Jonathan Henriksen, who's a digital imaging coordinator, Tony Rizzardi, who's a scientific coordinator, and Daniel Chang, a technician. And I'll describe a bit more of their work in a moment. So the goal of Northwest BioTrust is to access biospecimens and annotation services from informed and engaged patient populations in a manner that's cost-effective and self-sustaining and responsive to investigators' needs. So we're trying to develop a useful core that is cost-effective for the institution. It is an opportunity for patients to participate by donating their blood and tissue specimens. And for researchers, it offers a banked and catalog of biospecimens for use in their research studies. Not that every specimen that you might need is already banked, because we can certainly collect things prospectively based on your study needs, but some of the things that you might want could already be in freezers, of course. The IT system that the LSDF funds primarily put in allow researchers to access through a central web-based system information about their project. So what is the project? What is the IRB? It allows you a place to upload your IRB forms. What are the protocols? And then ultimately track delivery of samples all the way to invoices that would be invoiced against a project budget. So what's in place now? We have a website, and I'll show you just a couple of captions from that, with information for the public, with information for researchers, and with for more general information for patients. We are using a consent that it was approved through the Fred Hutch IRB, or the consortium IRB, which allows the collection not only of remnant tissues and associated blood specimens, but also buccal swabs, saliva for DNA, urine, things that might be useful for biomarker studies, and for prospective specimens. So if you needed tissue from a particular patient, so both remnant tissue from surgical specimens that already were going to be coming out, as well as prospectively collected things like an extra draw of blood or urine or so forth. In addition, we have an approved, what we call a front desk global IRB, that's consent, that's approved through the UW IRB. And this is just being rolled out, but the vision is that at every place of patient contact at UW medicine clinics and at SCCA clinics, this global consent will be issued by front desk staff. So when they're enrolling patients, the patients will be asked on a computerized form, will you allow remnant tissue to be used for research? Also, will you allow your health data to be used for research? And there's an opt-in for, if a patient is a perfect candidate for a later study. Can we recontact you to ask for your involvement in that study? So the vision is to get the vast majority of UW Medicine patients pre-consented at the time when they first come to be seen at any of the UW Medicine sites. That process is just rolling out. The consortium IRB that I mentioned first is one that we one-on-one with patients administer. We have operations right now in place in pathology here at University Medical Center and at the SCCA, where we are doing patient consenting and collecting, distributing specimens. And again, our goal is self-sustainability, and I'm going to talk a lot about that because it's elemental to this whole process. This is just a caption from our website, which you can see there at the bottom is the northwestbiotrust.org is the URL. And behind this website is the Northwest BioTrust IT system, which has been live as a version 1 since the end of the Peggy Porter CBR grant, which ended in August. And this has modules for searching for samples, for requesting samples, for patient identification, patient consenting, sample orders, sample delivery, data annotation, and for reporting on our services, both financial and operational metrics. How many samples did we ship, for example? I want to focus on the bottom part just to walk you through a little bit of this because it hits up lab medicine essentially right now. So this first bar is for research-only specimens. So this would be if you had a protocol where you needed to go out and obtain blood from patients who had a particular phenotype, or you needed tissue procured in a certain way from patients with a particular phenotype. And this, so you know a lot about what those patients are. You might want a patient from a particular surgeon or with a particular clinical diagnosis who might be seen at a particular time, who might also have other features. So for example, they might have to be between certain ages and also have presumed lung cancer plus diabetes, et cetera. And through an Amalga data warehouse query system, those criteria are screened of all the patients who are within the UW Medicine system. All of that data goes into a data warehouse. It gets searched through this Amalga query. And to our study coordinator, a list of possible eligible patients is provided. And the study coordinator then manually goes through and says which of these specimens looks like they're a good fit for this prospective collection. And if there's a good fit, she asks that a consenter goes and consents the patient for that study. And then as those specimens are obtained, there is a sample order and fulfillment, and all of that data goes into a biospecimen management software system, which we were just installing called Lab Matrix. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And then all of the data through an application programmer interface now goes out of Lab Matrix again into a data warehouse so that it's suitable for downstream studies, and we'll talk about that in a moment. For remnant tissue, the process is very similar. You know pretty much what types of patients you're going to be interested in for those. I want to focus on the bottom bar here, remnant blood, because that's very pertinent to lab medicine, and there's a lot of activity around that today. The amount of specimens that are flowing through lab medicine is immense compared with what's flowing through pathology. We don't have that many resections, from patients, but patients get their blood and other fluids drawn all the time. So the former type of search where you say, well, I know the provider and I know some things about the patient is not enough, because you'd end up with just mass quantities of blood to try to sort through and try to read EMRs on to pick the right bloods. So the nature of the searches for remnant blood tends to be highly granular. So it might be patients within a certain age who have a certain lab test value and also a certain clinical feature, so that when those pings now go to the lab medicine information system saying these patients look like they're a good match for this study, we don't end up with massive numbers of pulled bloods. So the the granularity for remnant blood is much higher. Again, after the bloods are pulled off into a research area within lab medicine using the reference testing service that you already have, those samples come to us and the data goes into the same biospecimen management system or lab matrix. So now that BSM system is populated with the basic stuff about the specimen. And again, it's available now out to the data warehousing systems. So why do we need the BSM? So basically, when a sample comes out of the pathology lab, all we know is basic stuff about who's the surgeon, what's the patient age, what was their clinical diagnosis. If one is interested in studying, say, lung cancer, you of course, going in, you may not know that the patient has lung cancer, and furthermore, you may not know what type of lung cancer they have. Their clinical diagnosis might be lung mass, and that's what flagged them for the research coordinator to ask for a consent and for tissue collection. And in fact, when that sample is stabilized that day, when the specimen comes out and we in PATH look at it, say, yes, we can take this part for research, the rest we have to preserve for diagnosis, for margins and things, we still don't know what it is exactly because, of course, it may be days later when we know everything we need to know about that lung tumor. What's the histologic type in a coded diagnostic system? What are the prognostic markers or other diagnostic features? All of that information that makes up the final report may not be available for several days after the resection. And so it's in Lab Matrix where all of those fields are available for us to go through based on scout slides and actually record per aliquot of tissue what's the diagnosis, how much necrosis is there, how much neoplasia, what's the percentage of neoplastic tissue versus non, et cetera. So that's the reason why we need that software. Also, the BSM system contains additional aliquot information. Where is it? Whose freezer? What drawer? What box? What row? Et cetera, so that we know exactly where those are. And then we can transfer those locations between laboratories. So if I ship a box of samples, pull them out of one freezer and ship them to another, all of those locations go to the virtual freezer maps of the recipient, be it a biorepository or a researcher. So it's really a key piece of software which we just got the servers, we're just putting it in right now. And it's being linked with the rest of the system through application programmer interfaces so that it can receive feeds and also so that all of that annotation data can go out to the data warehouse. So the data warehouse contains all sorts of information that has nothing to do with pathology. Lots of the EPIC data flows into the data warehouse. All sorts of payer data comes in here, et cetera. So it's a very rich source of data that can be mined for not just what's the specimen, but also lots of stuff about what's the patient. And at the Hutch, under the leadership of Paul Fern, there is a project called Hydra, which stands for the words there at the top, that where in addition to electronic medical record derived data and the specimen data that we just talked about, also there's space for experimental data. And so this is a way of trying to get all of these systems to talk together so that one can sit down and search for relevant data associated with specimens and so on. This is very much tied in with Dr. Holland's translational research program that crosses lots of different solid tumor lines. So just as another picture from the website, we have a virtual, called a VBD, a virtual biospecimen discovery. This contains records from all the samples that are already in various biorepositories around our institutions. And so one can look up and see what's already in the bank, if you will. And again, that's not to say that if it's not in the bank, you can't get it, because stuff comes through all the time, and so we can prospectively procure things even if it's not already collected. But the website is kind of interesting to peruse if you have a chance. In addition to these electronic means of annotating specimens, of course, a lot of science to date has been people manually abstracting information from the chart, and that will go on until such time as natural language processing is perfected to the point where it does as good a job as a human reading through charts. So we have, our Northwest BioTrust staff have standing approval to serve as honest brokers, where they have permission to peruse the EMR, collect data sets that researchers might request, so that we can provide not only the specimens, but also data that might be abstracted from the charts. Researchers can also get honest broker status to look at, to abstract data from the charts if they prefer to do it that way. And importantly, and we'll go into this in some depth, pathology annotations, detailed pathology annotations, much more than what's the diagnosis and how much necrosis is there, are important for us. They're mainly important because the specimens have so much more inherent value if you have a lot of data about them than if you just hand off a frozen piece of tissue and say that, you know, I'm only telling you a very limited amount of what's in that tube. And I think we'll get to why that's important. We have an Aperio scanner, which is used by lots of people around the university, including folks in lab medicine, where we can develop whole slide digital images from scans of slides. And once they're digitized, you can do all sorts of stuff. This is just a picture from, that's the scanner at the lower right there. This is just a picture from a study that I'm involved in, where we're doing 3D reconstructions of prostate tissue to correlate that with preoperative MRI to try to find MRI markers of aggressiveness of prostate cancer in vivo, to try to triage patients better in terms of whether they need definitive therapies like prostatectomy or whether they might be just as well watched. Additionally, there's nice software tools that one can use on digitized images. So this is just an example of a figure from a paper we submitted recently, where we're looking at the first column is hyaluronan synthase 2. This is a gene that's expressed in prostate cancer epithelium. And you can see that the blue stroma is negative for this marker by IHC, whereas this other marker, hyaluronan, is an extracellular polymer, which is out, it's sort of negatively staining the epithelium. It's out in the stroma. You can use image classification tools like Genie, which is one that Aperio markets that we use a lot, to basically auto-segment what the tissue is. So in this paint, if you will, the epithelium is painted blue and the stroma is painted in this kind of yellow. And similarly for this. And then within your channel of interest, you can quantify those immunostains. So here we've quantified the amount of brown staining, but only in the epithelial channel. Here we've quantified the amount of stromal staining for hyaluronan, and you can see intense means red in this particular pseudocolor. So there's quite a lot of hyaluronan in the stroma, and relatively little Has2 in the epithelium. But you can appreciate how getting information like this, continuous variable data on a biomarker of interest, is in much research demand from our many research clients. So we, as I mentioned, we're both collecting discarded specimens from laboratories and from PATH, discarded tissues, as well as prospective specimens from a couple of sites now, and certainly we'll grow this as UW Medicine expands to cover more hospitals, for example. I put this in just to remind myself, I suppose, that there's a lot of regulatory oversight that we have to be very cautious of when we're doing biobanking. In particular, if the patient has material that otherwise would be waste repurposed to research, that is subject to all of the usual clinical oversight, Joint Commission, which dictates what samples have to get reviewed by pathology, which ones don't. CLIA and CAP, as with deemed status under CLIA, has very specific rules as to what can be sampled and what can't be sampled for research. And so we're very cautious of all those rules. Versus if you consent a patient for a research-only specimen, like a blood draw, of course those need never go to the lab, or it might be an extra tissue biopsy that never goes to pathology. So those really are in a different world than the repurposed clinical materials, and those are subject to completely different regulations under IRB and so forth. So we're cognizant of the fact that we're subject to lots of oversight as we use this process. We also are realizing that if a specimen comes into our laboratories and some of it goes down for a research purpose, a lot of those research tests might be molecular tests that you all or others are developing, and that same process, pouncing on a specimen, determining what can be taken for research versus what can't, and going down the clinical flow, the otherwise clinical flow, is something we'd like to repurpose when those molecular tests come to be their own CLIA tests, so that we would envision handing frozen samples off to a CLIA lab using the same skilled technicians who were part of the process developing the test in the first place. So we feel like we're very much in a parallel course here with clinical and molecular diagnostics. Now, I'm going to segue a minute to talk about what we did at Minnesota, because I think it's that model which we're trying to adhere to. And I want to just, I guess, celebrate a little of the success of that model and tell you why we're enthusiastic about it, about replicating it here. At Minnesota, I was the founding director of an organization called BioNet, which also was a comprehensive facility for patient consenting, for procurement, for annotations, and for distribution of those materials for research. And part of our quality management plan included an emphasis on our business functions. We wanted to produce high quality work that was fiscally sustainable for the organization. When I arrived at Minnesota, the structure looked very much like this. There were lots of freezers full of lots of stuff distributed all across campus, but stuff wasn't well organized, and as a result, you would have freezers go down. People were unsure, is this stuff we're saving or not? What's in here anyhow? This belonged to somebody who retired. There was a desire to organize their materials, both for the stuff they already had as well as for things that were being collected ongoing. We sort of started in the inverse of the project here. We already had a well-functioning procurement facility that had been part of the Cancer Center, but we didn't have robust informatics to track specimens and try to tidy that up. And so it was very much a building from a research volume and trying to instill an IT and other organizational structure. That's different from what we have here in the sense that we had these 2 grants which have got a huge IT infrastructure in place, and now we're getting the operations up to speed with where the information technology is. So it's a better position, really. At Minnesota, we surveyed a huge number of researchers across campus. It came from the dean's office, and we basically asked them, what would you like such an IT system to look like? And lots of people said that they needed to store basic specimen information, shown in maroon, but also there were lots of other things that they wanted to track. Questionnaire data, longitudinal patient tracking, sequencing data, imaging correlations, custom fields. And so we tried to be responsive to that. What was of interest to us was that when you asked, if we put in such a system, would you be willing to migrate to use it as opposed to the system that you're currently using? Only 16% of people said no. So there was clearly a hunger for a robust system that could track and be flexible to input all of this data. We ended up picking a product called CA Tissue, which the NCI invested in and provides for free. And that is a good system for basic stuff like what's the coded diagnosis, what's the freezer location. It tends to be a little more cumbersome on the specimen associated data. So if I'm in a lab and I say I want to buy a partition of lab matrix and populate it with lots of data that's specific for my study, lab matrix that's really what it's powered to do in addition to the freezer mapping. CA Tissue is a little bit more basic product around freezer mapping and very basic specimen stuff. But anyhow, we put in CA Tissue there, and as a result, from servers on one part of campus, all of these various banks across the campus ended up buying into that one system so that at every site we had, barcode labeling and we can track all of the derivatization. Very much analogous to what's going on here, and will really expand as we put in lab matrix. Why track specimens? So I think this is the part that makes us in pathology the most nervous. And I'm going to tell you a true story about a 61-year-old man who had a neck dissection. And it was described as an irregular fragment of things that were cassetted. And the diagnosis came out, and it said, lymph nodes with no evidence of malignancy. Except that the clinician called and said, I don't understand this because the patient had a fine needle aspiration with metastatic melanoma right before surgery. And we tracked, this was before putting in the BioNet system, we tracked down the materials and we found that in fact he did have a metastatic melanoma history. And in fact tissue had disappeared from the growth room to a vaccine study, and it turned out that they erroneously took essentially all of the diagnostic tissue. And so we were able to at last retrieve that and re-web those materials to the case, in which case we addended the diagnosis as metastatic melanoma. So we're very aware that we need to track specimens from the moment they're available to the research product or people to their final consumption in the laboratory throughout that period. And we retain in all of our contracts with researchers clawback abilities to return, if needed, materials back to the clinical case. So we're building that same beginning to end tracking system here. Every time we go to the OR to say to the surgeons, this is a patient for whom we've consented for studies, we pepper their paperwork and their chart with blaze colored sheets that say this is a patient for whom we need representative tissue. And that way when the residents are dictating in, they'll say representative tissue was procured for potential research studies from specimen A or whatever. And our staff actually read all the pathology reports to make sure that that phrase is in there. Because if we know we took tissue and the phrase isn't in there, it makes our pathologists vulnerable to the fact that they may change their diagnosis if they knew there was tissue missing someplace and needed to be clawed back. So if we read a report that doesn't have that information, we again staple a blaze sheet on the report, put it in the pathologist box and say, there was tissue taken from this that never was mentioned in the report, and we're making you aware of this in case it would change your diagnosis. So shifting to economics a minute. There's been some nice work by NCI recently indicating that one of the major limitations of cancer research is the availability of high quality, well annotated biospecimens. And one of the biggest reasons why such specimens don't exist is that it's such an economic challenge to establish and sustain biobanking operations. In a paper called creatively Biobankonomics, which is a nice twist of phraseology, they are recommending things that we very much did in BioNet and that we're very much doing here. Number one, establish what your market really needs from you. Build scale. So it doesn't make sense for everybody to have redundant specimen procurement facilities for each lab, because then everybody is reduplicating an expense that we needn't reduplicate. Determine the total cost cycle of ownership. So we're getting very good at cost accounting. And don't overlook service-oriented revenues. And I'll belabor this in a moment, but these pathologist-delivered services, customized data sets like those derived from whole slide images, offering custodianship for specimens, i.e. we'll house your specimens for you because you may not want to have round-the-clock freezer coverage, and since we already have it, maybe you'd rather buy that space from us rather than redo it. Educational efforts. And by doing that, you can have a blend of funding, of contracts and grants, and fee-for-service activities to basically develop an organization of sufficient size in order to sort of float the boat financially. So the NCI best practices for biorepositories emphasizes the same thing, basically saying part of best practices is developing a robust business plan so that you can sustainably meet your costs, and that we have to focus on generating sufficient revenues. So in Minnesota, we got creative about accounting. I actually took some accounting courses because that was a topic I didn't know that much about. So we accounted for all of our costs: employee salaries, equipment depreciation, amortization of things like software that you can't formally depreciate, space, supplies. Basically, we knew what that specimen really cost. And it turns out it's not a small amount of money. In Minnesota, that turned out, we had a brisk business there because it had been going on for years as sort of unorganized for years before I got there. But when you tallied up all those costs, it was $140 per 100 milligram of tracked tissue. Now that sounds like a lot, especially to researchers who say, gee, I've been getting this for free all this time. But if you're NCI, it sure doesn't. I just wrote a grant to provide samples to their patient-derived xenograft, and they gave guidance as to what they expected to pay for a sample. And they expect to pay between $1,000 and $2,000 per sample. That's essentially what the typical grant guidance is. So they know it's very expensive. We've never had anyone on a grant review basis say, gosh, this facility sounds expensive. To the contrary, they like the fact it exists because it gives some credence to the fact that you can actually get the specimens that you propose to study. So the bottom line is we had official rates that were published, available online, and we liked to work with for-profit industry because we could increase our rates anywhere between 50 and 110%. Again, doing those sorts of contracts with industry primarily as a means of generating cash to sort of float the boat. Industry. If you look, this is from one of my favorite publications, The Economist. If you look at R&D spending in the US, this is as of 2011, 79% of R&D spending in the US is spent by industry. A relatively small amount is spent by government grants. So if you're running a core facility and you're trying to hit up revenue sources to pay for a relatively expensive organization like this, if you're going to look for one deep pocket out there, it's going to be industry. They can help float the boat and thus complete the mission for academic clients. So we got very good about working with industry. If you're an internal researcher, of course, you say, I would like specimens, and we help provide a statement of work and a quote and a budget. And then we have advisory committees that say, yes, this seems like a reasonable use of the tissue or not. You have an internal IRB that grants you permission or exemption from the need to have IRB approval. And then you get the specimens, do your research. We tried to mirror that exact process for external researchers. So we developed a standard services agreement whereby researchers could just say, I need these tissues, and they were devoid of IP, they were devoid of any sort of encumbrance. We basically delivered them as unfinished. I mean, they have no value really, it's just an unfinished piece of tissue. We had an advisory committee that considered the same thing. Is this a reasonable use of tissue? Also, is this something that's going to trample internal research? If so, probably we wouldn't do it. And then an outside IRB grants approval or exemption, and the tissues go out. So this was a very nice form, because I could sign on behalf of the Regents of the University of Minnesota, immediately execute a service contract with industry, and we were off and running under lots of oversights. And as a result, BioNet became really quite a thriving organization. We had a tissue procurement facility, histology and immunohistochemistry lab, and a digital imaging lab. And I would say that this is out of date now. By 2012, we had collected about 80,000 specimens from 30,000 patients, and with a distribution of disease types that you can see there. So it was quite a robust plan. I won't dwell on this, it's too long, but just to emphasize again that our quality management plan includes everything from SOPs to assuring everybody is appropriately trained, assuring that our freezers have 24/7 coverage. Pathologists actually check all of the samples that go out to tell you that yes, this is the following coded diagnosis, and here's how much necrosis, et cetera, is in there. All that will be here recorded in Lab Matrix. All of our equipment is depreciated, which is to say when it's used up, we've recaptured the money to buy the next piece of equipment so that we're not always in sort of a beggar's posture with our bosses. We can run it more as a business. All of it is maintained, calibrated. And we are subject to lots of internal, but importantly, external audits. So when you have, as you may know, when you have an NCI grant, they have the right to come and inspect and make sure that the samples that you say are from this type of patient actually do come from that patient. And many of our industry clients are even more audit prone. I mean, they schedule audits routinely because they're hyper vigilant about regulatory compliance as well. And last on the list, just to reemphasize yet again, we're trying to be very fiscally responsible so that we can get a large enough system to be self-sustaining. So BioNet, at the snapshot in time when I left it, was supporting 71 different PIs, ranging from the Cancer Center Support Grant to individual R01s. We had lots of other core facilities who utilized our services, so we passed things through to other cores, same as we'll be doing here. We had lots of other academic and governmental organizations, such as those listed here, and we worked quite a lot with the pharmaceutical industry and other service companies to them. So not only the 3Ms and the Genentechs of the world, but also companies like Astorand, which essentially are providers of tissue services to industry, and we like to think of them essentially as a sales team that's out there hitting up industry all the time saying, what do you need? We've got the ability to help you achieve your research aims by working with organizations like BioNet. You might think that a typical customer is somebody who walks out the door with a box of frozen tumors, and that actually turned out not to be true. A typical customer was somebody who came to us with a question and said, can you develop a cohort around a question that I have? And we would say yes. And oftentimes we would construct TMAs or selectively punch tissues, recuts, curls, TMA punches into tubes. We might optimize immunostains, and we might deliver for them then from digitized pathology a set of data. So it was very nice for industry because they could come with a question and walk away with spreadsheets of data without ever having touched a biospecimen in the course of their involvement with us. And obviously, this type of work is a lot more, well, there's two things about it. Number one, it's a lot more lucrative, if you will, in terms of trying to self-sustain than if you're just handing off tissue, which has relatively low value. And the second thing is, it makes the tissue almost infinitely extendable. So if I have a block of tissue and hand it to industry or to a researcher, that's it. If I have a block of tissue and I do a 1 millimeter TMA punch, that might be only 1/100th of the stuff that's in the block, and then the experiments are done on one section, of which there might be several hundred in the block. So you greatly amplify the utility of specimens by doing more full service work. So it was very scientifically productive, as I mentioned earlier, supporting a lot of studies. This is just a picture of our publication board in Minnesota. And I just want to focus on this because you'll see that we started small and we grew bigger quickly, but each year we were able to match our expenses to our revenues. Now you might look at that and say that's fishy. Not so much, because a lot of times we would drive industry revenue as we knew we were needing it to make up for anticipated losses. And if you asked what was the source of that revenue, certainly internal service charges to Minnesota faculty was the biggest, but close on its heels and certainly fast growing were external contracts with industry, usually along the can you give us data off tissue microarrays of a cohort of interest. Increasingly, we were getting some grant funding. Internal services were largely grant funded too. That was fee for service, but these were grants like TCGA grants and so forth that were directly written by the biobank itself. So what are we doing here? We're trying to develop essentially the same system for essentially the same reasons. We know this is a complicated process, and we know it has to be of sufficient scale, and we know that we're not going to be able to rely on lots of money coming from the dean's office every year. Ultimately, they're going to require us to be self-sufficient. So we've done essentially all of the same things. We have standard processes. We're trying to have a single point of entry, so people say, I need research tissues, they know where to go to. We have one email address for everybody across our campuses. And we're working closely with your department, John and others, to incorporate discarded blood specimens in here, which we think this is going to be a very nice resource because there's not very many biobanks around where you can say, I need blood with the following really granular details and walk away with a procured set. And as I mentioned before, we think this is going to be central to the larger efforts such as precision medicine and the combined Fred Hutch UW Cancer Molecular Diagnostics initiatives, since the way we procure tissues for research obviously will have to be very similar to the way the tissues are procured after the research turns into CLIA tests. We have approved rates. They've been approved by the School of Medicine and UW Upper Campus MAA office. They include rates for all the things that we talked about, specimen procurement. All of our people, myself and others, have hourly fees, and we have fees for whole slide scanning. We now have here also a very similar standard services agreement to work with outside industrial clients. And I've mentioned this because if there are companies and so forth that you want to work with, it's an easy way to help push stuff out. Importantly, although the university's indirect rate is, I guess, 54%, we're considered a goods and service, so they only apply, I think, a 15.6% indirect. So whether you're a university faculty or somebody outside the university, the cost really is not that much different. And we have now an accounting and invoicing system which very much matches the logic of the Northwest BioTrust IT system, so that the project and project budgets are mirrored with the accounting invoicing process. So much like Minnesota, our workflows are quite similar. So if you're internal, you already know what the process is. If you're external, same thing. They request specimens. We have a governance committee that we're establishing. We haven't yet signed an SA. That's a relatively new development. But the same questions. Is this going to negatively impact work at the U or other institutions? If yes, we won't do it. But if it's something that won't, and we need the volume of business to float our operation, then we will be doing it, subject to outside IRB approvals. So we're trying to establish essentially the exact same system, and quite a lot of work has been done towards that goal. I'm not going to read through all these, but I just wanted to show that there are a lot of projects that are already underway in Northwest BioTrust, including some faculty of yours, Jeff Baird, for example. Sindhu Cherian has an education project using whole slide scans. We're starting to use our systems for tumor boards. So the breast tumor board down at the Hutch, they now scan the slides instead of carrying glass down there. There's a lot of people at the Hutch who use us, mostly repositories at this time, but increasingly individual investigators. So we're sort of a hub and spoke system here. And we're starting to work more with external entities. So I mentioned that we're supplying NCI for their patient-derived xenograft program, similar to what we do for Jackson Labs, providing samples to them. This is a study by Dr. Oliver Press looking at a medical device that to try to predict response to therapy in lymphomas. So already building a book of business, so we certainly have a long ways to go. Here we'll need about 100 at any given time we're going to need about 100 projects, which is a lot to sort of keep track of course. And it also implies a whole lot of letters of support and budgets and things for grants that don't fund. So you can imagine that that work is 10, 20-fold on the sort of helping people prep grant side of things. But we're getting there. So this is a picture of some of the team at the launch of year 3. That's why people have 3 digits up of the CBR grant. And this is some of the members of the team. I'm in the very back, which is I guess I'm more introverted than those who jumped right to the front of the line. And with that, I would just leave you with our email address. So basically, if you put your inquiry into that email address, it fans out to all of the team members so that we can organize ourselves to respond to your inquiry, ideally with a statement of work, project budget, and then as we deliver with invoices soon to follow. So thanks, and I'll take any questions.
So is it my understanding for your remnant tissue that you get an IRB and then it's linked in the settings that if an investigator wants tissue, they get a waiver as opposed to going through their own IRB through human subjects here?
It depends. So our consent, if you, let's say you had a clinical trial and in clinic you enrolled a patient and that patient knew that, of course, they were part of your clinical trial. Our IRB allows us to reveal those samples by name to you because you already have IRB approval for that information. So in that case, you wouldn't get exemption, you'd have to go through a full IRB review for the clinical trial because you're getting identified specimens. If it's data that's coded but not de-identified, you typically have to go through an IRB approval process to receive limited data sets. If it's something where you just say, I need lung cancer tissue from people who are older than 60 or something like that, where it's truly de-identified specimens, then it would be waiver. And then we have 2 IRBs here, the Hutch IRB and the UW IRB. If it's a cancer project and you're a Hutch member, it goes through the Hutch IRB, and they're the ones who give you a waiver. If it's not cancer and or you're not a Hutch member, the UW IRB allows you to self-determine that your study is exempt. So there's a few flavors, but the answer is yes or no depending on the particulars of the study. Does that make sense?
Sorry. So you're going to be, at this point forward, you're going to be prospectively consenting people as they come into the University of Washington. And what type of consent is that, and what type of data will you have access to on the patients that come in and check the box on your electronic consent?
Yeah, so the question has to do with the global consent. That's the front desk consent. It's a 1-page consent where the patients sign in Epic, and it asks basically 3 questions. Can I have your remnant specimens and data, and can I contact you in the future? The contact you in the future part goes to an ITHS program that tracks all of those things to identify patients who might be useful. Otherwise, the data, essentially all of our data streams, and this actually is a question that Dr. Tate might know better than I, essentially all of the data around patients from Epic, from their billing data, from all that stuff goes into the Amalga data warehouse.
Can we have Amalga for you?
That's right, and so ITHS again runs a desk, if you will, that will execute an Amalga query for any piece of that data that you like. So it includes everything from transcribed notes to detailed laboratory values and so on.
Hi Steve, thanks for nice talk and for taking on this ambitious project. We get a lot of blood specimens every day. How do you envision, relative to the amount of tissue, how do you envision storing blood, selecting what specimens to save versus not, and going about?
So, we're only culling those specimens that researchers ask for. So now, often what we'll do is if there's a lot of blood left over, we'll spin it and aliquot it out and give them an aliquot. Because, of course, the types of specimens that researchers ask for are likely to be asked for again, and so there's some reason to store them. But in terms of all the blood flowing through, unless somebody said, I want blood with those granular characteristics, we won't be retrieving it. Because, for the reasons that you're implying, which is to say we'd end up with, the whole building would be full of freezers. And so it's really more of a pass-through process with potential to save some if there's more than they need.
So Steve, if I recall, in terms of IRB type stuff, patients can't just say, I consent for whatever the heck you want to use it for any study ever in the future, correct? Or is that what the blanket consent actually lets them do?
So the question is, does the blanket consent allow the patient to participate in any study under the sun? Yes. But you as a researcher you have a more narrowly defined study that you're wanting to access these samples to. So really it goes through the IRB twice.
But you don't have to go back and contact the patient and say, okay, now we want to use your tissue for this study.
That's correct.
Now we want to use your tissue for a new study, that kind of thing.
That's right. So the study is very broadly defined as scientific understanding about disease. Yeah, so it's essentially, yes, we can use them for any type of scientific endeavor.
Do you envision that plasmapheresis, plasma that's been extracted from people, is that acceptable, do you think, as a biospecimen under this umbrella?
The question is, would plasmapheresis material or plasma be useful? I should say, as we're rolling out the discarded lab medicine samples, we're hitting up only a few tube types. And the reason is that some of them are much more likely to have sufficient DNA to do DNA studies. Some of them might be better for plasma for usual biomarker type studies. Certainly plasmapheresis is not in that original set of things that we're looking at as we roll it out, but if there's demand for it, I don't see why that couldn't happen.
Plasmapheresis would be great for you guys to collect, as I have a refrigerator and freezer that have multiple samples, but some of those are the most interesting ones when we're actually getting large quantities of things that people may want to purify or something.
Understood. So plasmapheresis sounds like something we should consider. Other questions? Great. Thank you very much.